Good afternoon, everyone. It's Stacy Cacciatore. Thank you guys for joining today in my dissertation defense on princesses, divas, and mother runners, gendered, institutional, and vernacular rhetorics and running events. From a logistical standpoint, I'm going to drop a link to the script in the chat window so you can follow along or review afterwards. My journey in writing this dissertation began years ago, years before the dream of pursuing my doctorate became a reality. My expedition in becoming a runner is not dissimilar in my journey in becoming a scholar. As I was writing this dissertation, it became clear with every word, paragraph, and chapter that the metaphor of running was apropos to my writing and research process. Over the past 10 years, I've run over 100 road races, from 5Ks to full marathons, traveling across the United States to participate. As I ran in these runs, one thing became clear. The rhetorics of gender affected women's participation. But how? I couldn't quite place my finger on it. Feeling this sense of difference inspired me to focus my dissertation on gendered rhetorical themes in running events. A central concern of my dissertation involves demonstrating how co-ed, women's, and virtual running events are gendered, both through institutional and vernacular rhetorics. My dissertation sought to answer three primary questions. In what ways are the rhetorics of co-ed and women's running events gendered? What are the similarities and differences between institutional and vernacular rhetorics at these events? And how are rhetorics in virtual events gendered digitally? To answer these research questions, I first examined the gendered history of women's running. In Chapter 2, I examined historical artifacts, such as paintings at smock races, which provided insight into how women were sexualized even in these running events of the 16th, 18th, and 17th and 18th centuries. I studied the pedestrian craze of the 18th century and accounts of women pedestrians, Bertha von Hilleren and Ada Anderson. I reviewed the International Committee meeting minutes to better understand why women's running events of greater than 800 meters were banned until 1928 and again until 1960. I analyzed the groundbreaking moment when Kathrine Switzer crashed the Boston Marathon and ran under the guise of a man. When race director Jock Semple found out a woman ran his race, he attempted to rip off her race bib and push her off course. Because of this fanfare, many sources actually incorrectly named Switzer as the first American woman marathoner, when in fact it was Bobby Gibb who ran the marathon 1 year prior to Switzer in 1966. She quietly crossed the finish line, and her contributions to women's running have often gone unnoticed. In Chapter 3, I explored the institutional and vernacular rhetorics in 4 co-ed running events that occurred between 2019 and 2020. The Boston Marathon, the Chicago Marathon, the New York Marathon, and the London Marathon. I chose these events due to their popularity, size, significance, and ratio of male to female runners. To compare and contrast with women's running events, in Chapter 4, I researched 3 women's focused in-person running events during that same period. The Disney Princess Half Marathon, the Divas Half Marathon, the USA Women's Half Marathon. In Chapter 5, I examined 3 virtual running events that occurred post-COVID, including the virtual Chicago Marathon, the virtual New York Marathon, and the virtual Boston Marathon. These virtual events are particularly relevant to this study since I include their in-person counterparts in the co-ed running chapter. Of these 10 events, I personally participated in 7 of them. By exploring the in-person and virtual versions of these events, I was able to effectively understand material differences and similarities that occur due to the modality. My dissertation employed a bricolage approach to apply 3 methodologies, including material feminist, embodied vernacularity, and intersectionality. I applied a feminist materialist methodology, which seeks to understand how materiality, language, and the everyday work jointly as an integrated experience. Through using this method, I examined race medals, swag bags, and jewelry. I also examined the physical nature of the gendered urban design of the city, examining seemingly mundane items such as porta potty design. I spoke earlier about institutional and vernacular rhetorics, and I want to make sure it's clear what I mean by those terms. Institutional rhetorics are the official voices of the events, expressed through communications through race directors, through official websites, social media channels, race maps, and event guides. Vernacular rhetorics are the voices of individuals who are not in positions of power. Specifically, I leveraged Liz Barr's embodied vernacularity, which accounts for the power of the community to influence dominant narratives through actions. From a vernacular rhetorics perspective, I conducted interviews with women runners, read social media posts, read runner blogs, and examined participant-created costumes. Now that we've established the events I studied and the methodology and methods that I used, let's explore key themes in my findings. There are 5 big themes that I plan to discuss today. Rhetorics of running events are gendered through rhetorical themes of heteronormativity, the rhetorics of altruism, the rhetorics of morality, urban design, and the rhetorics of protection of violence. As I pursued this work, I originally thought that I would focus solely on women's bodies at the intersection of fat studies, gender, rhetorics, and sports. However, as I began to dig into the artifacts, I discovered more areas of oppression related to gender and running, placing many women on the sidelines. I discovered themes related to hegemonic femininity, sexuality, morality, and motherhood. At that moment, it hit me. The rhetorics of running are gendered and create dynamics of power over a variety of women. Whether women are being pushed to the margins because of their gender, sexuality, reproductive capability, or body size, the effect is the same. Running rhetorics reinforce dominant power structures that privilege the masculine experience. I'm going to first start by discussing a theme that may not be too surprising. The world of running is brimming with expectations for women to conform to heteronormative constructions of femininity. Given that the women's races in my study include the Disney Princess Half Marathon, USA Women's Half Marathon, and Divas Half Marathon, I was not surprised to see overt articulations of femininity, such as sparkly race medals, women running in costume. However, as I looked deeper into the rhetorics in both vernacular and institutional spaces, I discovered that much of this messaging is rooted in homophobia. There are many examples of both co-ed and women's running events that convey messages of heteronormative expectations. Of course, there are obvious examples, such as the linguistic sexism present in the titles of these races and accompanying materials. I call your attention to the fact that gendered rhetorics that are laced with sexist, violent, and heteronormative themes extend beyond the language of sports. In fact, institutional and vernacular gendered rhetorics are embedded in the material and everyday practices of running. Heteronormative rhetorics also pervade the space through a focus on heterosexual relationships. For example, the Divas Half Marathon has shirtless firemen at the finish line. The USA Women's Half Marathon has men in tuxedos handing out Tiffany jewelry. The Disney Princess Half Marathon offered photo opportunities with Disney Princess at every mile marker, had a different heterosexual couple featured, and the race award was Cinderella's glass slipper. There is also an expectation for women to appear heterosexy, meaning to appear sexy for the sake of appreciation of her looks under the male gaze. One way in which this occurs is through the practice of dressing in costume, which interestingly is primarily pervasive in the vernacular rhetorics. Another example, this time in the institutional rhetoric space, is through the practice of providing tight athletic women's shirts instead of unisex shirts. These shirts demonstrate the focus on the female body. Take a look at this photo that compares a unisex shirt, which the Disney Princess Half Marathon used to provide, with a women's athletic shirt. Notice the differences in the nips and tucks around the waist and breast areas. There are certainly negative implications to running events reinforcing heteronormativity. I'm particularly concerned about the implications for transgender women runners. Recent rulings in the sport of running, such as NCAA's new policy regarding transgender participation in sports, may seem inclusive, but they're actually more damaging than helpful. The new rule places arbitrary parameters around testosterone levels, which can actually cause more exclusion than inclusion. However, I want to make it clear that I'm not disparaging the practice of women running in costumes. In fact, many women have taken to running in costumes as a way to reclaim a space in which they were previously denied, and leverage this practice as embodied vernacularity and activism. For instance, Monica Allen, who is wearing a tutu to raise awareness for her experience with a cancerous brain tumor. Self magazine ran the article with Allen's photo in their legit or lame column, dubbing the practice as lame, without understanding the context for why she did this. I liken the practice to what Carleen Corse Campbell found among women rhetorics, who leveraged a feminine style in the masculine space of public speaking to enhance their ethos. I posit that women runners have leveraged a similar feminine style of dressing in costume to create a space for themselves in the running world and embody empowerment. And I argue that by criticizing the practice of dressing in costume, this reinforces patriarchal structures that privilege traditional masculine practices. Related to the rhetorics of heteronormativity, I now shift to discuss the rhetorics of altruism. These rhetorics of altruism articulate that women runners are expected to run for someone outside themselves. For example, during the first Olympics, married women were not allowed to participate or even watch, but single women were allowed to attend since it could help them attract a mate. In the smock races of the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, women were expected to run to attract a husband. As you can see from this painting, it seems as if women were running more for the pleasure of the surrounding men than for sport. Notice their ample breasts spilling out of their dresses and men ogling over them. A sporting magazine wrote at the time, "Maids who wish to be wives cannot do better than run for the smock, as it will afford ample opportunity to demonstrate their strength and pliability when called into action." Later in the 1970s and 80s, women were told that they should run to attract a man, but be careful once they were married. They should only run if their husband also ran. In 1988, Mark Bloom wrote in a New York Times article that many couples got divorced before women could run because men spent their free time running. The cartoon accompanying this article shows a man heading out the door for a run while his wife tugs on him, begging him to stay with her, as if her life is unfulfilled and meaningless without a man. Bloom argued in this article that since women could now run, they could run with their husbands and improve their relationships. However, they should be careful about running on their own, as he warned women runners to make sure they choose a partner who is also a runner, because the man who does not run often feels threatened by his mate's emerging independence. In modern-day running events, the theme of women running for someone outside themselves primarily showed up through the expectation for women to run for their children. In co-ed running events, we saw this show up through interviews with women runners, such as Stephanie Bruce and Kara Goucher. Boston marathoners Bruce and Goucher are both renowned athletes. However, the focus in the news coverage of their marathon finishes centers on their role as a wife and mother first and foremost. Stephanie Bruce took to Instagram to speak about how she takes her kids with her on the road, but for those times she cannot take them, she says, "I hope my boys remember Mom was leaving them so often for a reason, that I wasn't just going on vacations, but living out my dreams racing." Of course, the underlying message was that women shouldn't leave their children for personal passions or pursuits, but doing so for a reason was okay. Bruce ended the post with a hashtag mom guilt. The hashtag mom guilt is pervasive throughout the gendered rhetorics of running. Consider that the hashtag mom guilt has over 161,000 posts on Instagram, whereas hashtag dad guilt only has 1,000. Women are often told that they should strive to have it all, which is a myth. Their pervasive running rhetorics contribute to an arbitrary set of rules and expectations that women can run if they are doing so to improve their ability to become a good wife or mother, if they are feminine or sexy, if they're running for altruistic reasons. The message of if conveys that women can only run to pursue their passions as a recreational activity if they continue to prioritize their role as a wife and mother. Related to the rhetorical theme of motherhood and the message of having it all, are the rhetorics of morality. Running is an activity tied closely with moral attributes of discipline, selflessness, and dedication. As such, perhaps it shouldn't be such a surprise that running rhetorics are tied with messages of morality. We saw from the early times that women runners were judged for their morality. During the pedestrian craze, Bertha von Hillern and other women pedestrians who were judged and criticized for bucking Victorian moral standards because running was seen as immoral. Motherhood and morality are closely linked. In the Run Disney blog surrounding the Disney Princess Half Marathon, Disney conducted an interview with a mother runner who focused on how even more important than running the half marathon was seeing her little man participate in the diaper dash. Both the Divas Half Marathon and the Women's USA Half Marathon reinforced the wine-drinking mom trope by offering mimosas and champagne at the finish line and wine-drinking mom shirts. The Disney Princess Half Marathon also correlated weight and gender through juxtaposition of Ariel and Ursula on their race medals. The Disney Princess Half Marathon featured Ariel, the heroine of Little Mermaid, on their 5K medal. Ariel represents innocence, morality, and naivety. In juxtaposition of Ariel's morality, Disney portrays the villain Ursula in the villain's race. Ursula, the villain in the movie, is a fat sea urchin who represents evil, immorality, and lack of discipline. Women with a larger body size are often portrayed as morally irresponsible and lacking self-control. If you look at the photo I'm sharing of the medals, notice how Ariel's body is the focus of the design. She's wearing just a bra with her tiny waist and breasts featured. Ursula, on the other hand, is displayed with just her face above one tentacle. The subtle messaging behind these materials are that larger women are both immoral and should loathe their body. I now shift to discuss the interesting rhetorical theme of effective rhetorics through gendered urban design and co-ed running events. The design of the city intermingles with the race course, creating a new gendered narrative on race day. I posit that the gendered narrative experience is shaped through what is added and what's taken away. For instance, in the Chicago Marathon, the addition of course marshals on every corner, lighting in areas that were previously dimly lit, and the presence of police and EMTs creates a safer environment for women to run. Consider the booziest street in Chicago that runners run past on the marathon course. During the marathon, women do not have to worry about being catcalled, harassed, or attacked when running past these bars. But during other times of the day or night, a woman cannot run or walk down that same street with a level of safety nor free from fear. Co-ed running events are also closely tied in with a gender narrative of city design, given the tremendous focus on location in the race rhetorics. Consider, for example, how all of the co-ed running events in this study center on the location of the event: Chicago, New York, London, Boston. Conversely, the women's running events in this study focus on aspects of being a woman, a princess, or a diva, rather than race location. Given this focus, I posit that the race location is more gendered and holds greater rhetorical significance in running events. Commingling space, place, and gender creates special considerations for the hybrid space of virtual running events. Consider that the virtual New York Marathon required the use of Strava. This practice created a hybrid space in which runners ran alone yet together. And while that may seem counterintuitive, I posit that the hybrid space of virtual running events is actually more social and networked than in-person events. I found that runners connected more in these spaces, as location did not act as a barrier. From a gender perspective, another interesting trend emerged, which is that women use mobile and locative media and self-tracking technologies differently than men. While men tended to upload their latest Strava time, pace, and distance to social media, women engaged in social networking forums to ask for advice, connect with other runners, and share experiences. However, virtual running events in this study seemingly ignored that component of runners' lived experiences and focused on using these technologies for competition, not connection. Coinciding with the gendered rhetorics of urban city design, I now shift to discuss the rhetorics of protection and violence. I discovered the rhetorical themes relating to women needing protection against their own propensity to act immorally. Ironically, this messaging, which is particularly visible through the damsel in distress archetype, articulates that women need men to protect them. The message is that a woman needs a man to save her. A study conducted by Runner's World found that 84% of women have been harassed or assaulted while running. 94% reported that their perpetrators were men. One example of how these rhetorics manifest in vernacular rhetorics in women's running events is through the Princess Protection Committee shirts that are made for men running in these events. This messaging is particularly infuriating because it conveys that men would only run in this woman-focused event if it's to protect a woman. But protect a woman from what? Another man? I don't want to make it seem like women are the passive recipients of this messaging. Many women leverage embodied vernacularity to speak out against the messaging by creating their own shirts, such as this one that says, "This princess saves herself." Of course, one can make the argument that women who sign up for a Disney race should fully expect the damsel in distress archetype to make an appearance. While that's a fair point, the matter becomes more complicated when you tie together the rhetorical themes of women needing protection alongside the violence in these events. Women do not sign up for the misogyny, harassment, and violence that manifest, partly because of this trope. To illustrate this point, the vernacular rhetorics of the Disney Princess Half Marathon consider how women runners are subject to violence and harassment. As a case in point, consider the Dead Last Start Challenge, which was created in the vernacular space of the Run Disney Run Facebook group. In the rulebook for the Dead Last Start Challenge, male participants are encouraged to start in the last corral and count the number of princesses, aka kills. This is just one example of many of the violence and harassment that women receive on their runs. In virtual races, this violence and harassment becomes even more of a pronounced issue. When women run in virtual races, they do not have the safety mechanisms in place that exist in physical races. Additionally, given that many events require the use of Strava and other mobile tracking applications, this can result in a dangerous lived reality for women. As a case in point, I discovered there are instances in which women have been followed on their runs by perpetrators using Strava to stalk their location. For the future of running, virtual running events are on the rise, a trend that began prior to COVID, rising from 479 events in 2016 to over 15,000 in 2020. Given this, I hope to focus future work on the effects of virtual running on gendered rhetorics. While it still may be early to tell what the effects of this move to virtual will be, we already know that this is a gender topic, given that a recent study found that while the percentage of women runners had already tipped the scales into the majority in 2019, the nature of virtual races widened this gap. In 2020, 75% of virtual runners identified as women, compared to only 25% of men. And while COVID certainly has played a role in the rise of virtual running, I don't see this trend going away anytime soon. I foresee a future of virtual racing in which hybrid spaces become the norm versus a misunderstood concept in which physical and virtual are seen separate and distinct. Given the change of landscape in the world of running from in-person to virtual events, we are going to see an increase in how gender relations shape digital leisure practices and online activism. Another area of research I want to expand upon is digital activism and advocacy for women of all races, genders, and sexualities. There are pockets of this inclusion today, and I'm encouraged that this trend will continue. As such, I plan to extend further research into embodied vernacularity and quiet activism through mobile and local media. Overall, in this dissertation, I established that there are both similarities and differences. This is going to be too hard to do. Overall, in this dissertation, I established that there are both similarities and differences in the way gendered rhetorics manifest between co-ed, women's, and virtual running events. Running reflects an extension of our heteropatriarchal society in the sense that official voices extol a move towards inclusivity, but the lived experience demonstrates that the real, everyday, embodied experience of women runners is still not being considered. As I mentioned in the beginning, the process of writing this dissertation is not dissimilar to running a marathon. As I round the corner to mile 26 of the Chicago Marathon, I only have 0.2 miles left. I look to my left and see spectators lining the streets, holding signs, clanging cowbells, and shouting words of encouragement. I remove my headphones, wanting to soak in the ambience. I glance to my right and see fellow runners trudging up a hill to the finish line. This journey has been long and filled with potholes and triumph, blood, sweat, and tears. And of course, there were moments of feeling defeat, detours to heading in the wrong direction, and need to course correct. I tripped across a few cracks in the sidewalk and ended up with a few skinned knees. There were times I headed out in one direction and took the long way down the path, only to discover I was running the wrong way, but I put one foot in front of the other. I spot the bright pink compression socks of a runner whom I'd been solidly behind for the majority of the race. I felt a sense of connection with her even though we had not uttered a word to each other, one foot in front of the other. What seemed impossible 26 miles ago is now upon the horizon, and I can see the finish line ahead. Crossing the finish line does not solely represent the completion of 26 miles on the streets of Chicago on this windy morning. Rather, it's the culmination of 4 months of training, sacrifice weekends, scorching hot summer runs, with air so humid it felt like running in a steam room, and negotiations with myself and family to dedicate a portion of my life to achieve this goal. Just like a marathon, this dissertation is not about trials and tribulations, it's about resiliency. The ability to pick myself up each time I fall and learn lessons for next time. Do not go that route, apply this technique, and don't eat that brownie before getting started. Okay, maybe that one just applies to running. But here we are at the end of the course, sweaty, exhausted, and a bit out of sorts, but the experience was invaluable. The feeling of exhilaration cannot be put into words. I raise my arms in the air as I cross the finish line and welcome the medal around my neck, on to the next race. As I come to a close, I want to thank those who supported me on this journey. My advisor, Michelle Smith, has gone above and beyond in supporting me in the dissertation process. Dr. Smith provided tremendous support, words of encouragement, coaching, and reviewing my long and rough drafts, meeting with me weekly, and helping me achieve my goals on an accelerated timeline. Jordan Fritz sparked a passion within my soul on digital rhetorics and the relationship to virtual running and activism in his seminar. I'm grateful to Brian Denham for his direction on conducting sport and communications research, especially during the independent study Dr. Denham led. I appreciate Kristen Okamoto for pointing me towards important resources along the way. I want to thank Dr. Cynthia Haynes for her inspiration and use of the Maestri style. I also am indebted to Dr. Jan Holvemick for introducing me to Adobe products, which have been invaluable. I also want to thank Dr. Blakesley for taking a chance on me and hiring me as managing editor for the WAC Journal. And a special thanks to Dr. Ursoy for introducing me to the narrative architecture concept, which inspired Chapter 3 of this dissertation. I also want to thank my dissertation writing group members, Victoria Hauser and Sarah Richardson, who have read and offered valuable feedback on drafts and ideas. Writing a dissertation is both an intellectual and emotional journey. As such, I extend a special thank you to Katie Rubin and Kate Anthony. Lastly, but most importantly, I'm incredibly grateful to my children, Joshua and Emily Cacciatore, for being there with me every step of the way. They are and always have been my source of inspiration.